week as there has been a ton of news in the world of Penn State sports. Specifically today especially in the last few hours to last 10 minutes, there's been a ton going on in the world of Penn State sports. Starting off not chronologically, but with the most important Penn State news since our last show. Unfortunately, just about 10 minutes ago, Penn State hockey in the Big Ten tournament, the Big Ten semifinals, after upsetting Notre Dame on their home ice in South Bend, Indiana yesterday. Penn State moved on to play Wisconsin, the number one overall seed, with the best player in the country, Cole Caulfield, top prospect of the Montreal Canadiens, who will certainly signed a big deal for a lot of money and probably have a long NHL career. Caulfield dominating for Wisconsin this whole season. He has 25 goals this season. No one else has more than 18. He was just a force to be reckoned with, and the whole team Wisconsin really came together this year after a down year last year. So Penn State had their hands full today. And of course, they had that long layoff after the over a month of COVID issues, playing against Notre Dame on January 29th, then getting 2 games in Ann Arbor against Michigan canceled, 4 games at home against OSU and Arizona State canceled, and then finally the series against Minnesota canceled. So Penn State going over a month without playing a game, then was able to get their series in at Notre Dame last week. Got blown out of both games, but just very rusty. But they looked very good yesterday against Notre Dame. Notre Dame number 19 in the country. Penn State looked great against them, getting a 6-3 win, just offense dominant, doubling up the Notre Dame. Today against Wisconsin. Wisconsin, as I said, number 1 seed in the tournament. They are already a lock for the NCAA tournament, so not a huge game for them, but probably just to improve seeding. And Penn State took it down to the wire with them. Penn State beating them in the third period. And as Wisconsin scored a goal in the first, Penn State able to tie it up in the second. And then in the third, 2 goals by each team. Cole Caulfield tied it late. And then in overtime, just about 6 minutes, 50 seconds into overtime, Cole Caulfield scored again on Eric Audio, ending the game with an overtime winner, and unfortunately ending Penn State's season because there is virtually no chance that they receive an at-large bid to the NCAA tournament. So Penn State hockey, after a disappointing season, just filled with so many postponements and cancellations due to COVID, will wrap up their season in Notre Dame in the Big Ten tournament, at Notre Dame in the Big Ten tournament, where they lost to one of the best teams in the country in Wisconsin. So it's disappointing, of course. The number 5 team in the country there, you can't really hang your head. Penn State getting goals today, 2 by Tim Doherty, who had especially a beautiful backhand to take the lead in the third period. 2 by Tim Doherty, as well as 1 by Alex Lamouche, Hobie Baker finalist multiple times. He's been spectacular for this program. The Virginia native coming up to Penn State will certainly make a bid for an NHL roster spot coming up. But yeah, Penn State falling to Wisconsin 4-3. Wisconsin will move on to the Big Ten championship game against either Michigan or Minnesota. So Penn State, lost many seniors since last year. Many big names, specifically, Liam Folks, who famously beat Wisconsin in overtime in the Big Ten championship title game just 3 years ago. And Penn State got the win on that one. But just given last year, COVID, they would have made the tournament. They would have been high seed in the tournament. Of course, the tournament didn't even happen. And then this year, after losing so many guys, they kind of didn't have much they could do without so many big names. Liam Folks, obviously, as I said, a huge name who they had lost since last year. Peyton Jones, they lost him to the NHL, where he's been fighting for playing time in Colorado. He holds virtually every goaltending record at Penn State: wins, shutouts, games played, save percentage. goals against everything pretty much. So between losing them, Will Holt Forster, Dennis Smirnov, Blake Gober, Nate Soucies, Nikita Pavlichev, Brandon Byro is the captain, James Gobitz, Chris Malari, just losing so many elite names. It is quite impressive that Penn State, given that and all the COVID issues this season, able to make a bit of a run, win a game in the Big Ten tournament, very, very nearly go to the Big Ten championship, taking Notre Dame down to the wire. So very impressive for Penn State hockey this year. But while they will not be moving on, Penn State basketball, unsurprisingly, also not moving on, as that would have been the shock of the season in college sports if they had been able to win the Big Ten tournament and get a bid. But Penn State basketball made a hiring today of their new head coach after terminating the contract of interim head coach Jim Ferry. But Director of Athletics Sandy Barber, Director of Penn State Athletics today, made an announcement that, quote, Micah Shrewsbury was a name that immediately jumped to the top of our list with his experience in the Big Ten and the NBA. He has had success at all levels and knows what it takes to develop a program into a consistent national championship contender. He's learned from and worked from under some of the most respected coaches in the country, in Brad Stevens and Matt Painter, and he will be an exceptional leader for the young men in our basketball program. So, Micah Shrewsbury, new head coach of Penn State basketball. He does have quite an impressive resume that he's bringing to State College, having been an assistant for 5 years over 2 stints at Purdue, as well as 7 years in the NBA with the Boston Celtics, and 4 years with Butler basketball. Obviously, that connection staying strong, going from Butler with Brad Stevens as the head coach there to the Celtics, which Brad Stevens currently coaches. And he was an assistant coach to Butler when they famously made runs to the national championship game, losing to Duke and UConn in back-to-back years in the national championship. He was on that coaching staff. So an impressive resume for him, and truly not a great program. Penn State had such a magical season last year, cut short by COVID when they would have broken their 11-year tournament drought. But unfortunate, cannot happen this year. But they do get a good coach in Michael Shrewsbury. This is his first head coaching job after, for 22 years he's been an assistant head coach, starting at Wabash, a small private school in Division III in Indiana, and then moving on to DePaul, another small private school in Division III, and then slowly working his way up to Marshall, IU South Bend, Butler, Purdue, the Celtics, back to Purdue, and now to Penn State. So a good hiring for Penn State. And Jim Ferry, really, it was not a terrible coach. It's not like he was, such a terrible season with him. They lost a lot of big names, similar to the hockey team. But Jim Ferry, given the situation he was put in, was all right, but certainly was not the answer for Penn State basketball. And a good move to be hiring Micah Shrewsbury. So two sets of kind of huge news breaking on the same day for Penn State, with Micah Shrewsbury announced as the men's basketball coach, the hockey team finishing their season with a heartbreaking loss in the Big Ten championship tournament semifinal. But still, lots of elite sports happening at Penn State, as they still have 8 teams ranked, tied for the most in the country, with wrestling, historically dominant, of course. Wrestling number 2 in the polls, men's gymnastics and women's lacrosse both number 5, women's volleyball and men's lacrosse both number 12, men's volleyball number 9, women's soccer number 19, women's hockey number 8. So 8 sports across Penn State, dominating and ranked high in the polls. Penn State baseball also getting underway. Recently, this past weekend, they had played against Indiana, 4 games at Indiana, losing all 4 of those. Penn State baseball never been a historically good program But after they did beat Northwestern last week, 13-10, kind of a crazy game. Trying to build off that, we're not able to do so. 4 straight losses to Indiana, with doubleheaders on Saturday and Sunday. Penn State was in those games 7-2, 8-0, 6-5, and 2-1. In addition to that, Penn State baseball coming up next weekend will be playing Maryland, one of their teams they'd be fighting for recruits with around Pennsylvania and Maryland areas. But Penn State has 3 games at home against Maryland. That'll be their home opener next weekend, as they have back-to-back series in Penn State with 3 against Maryland next weekend, and then 3 more the weekend after that against Big Ten perennial powerhouse Michigan. So Penn State baseball, pretty typical start to the year for them. They've always been kind of a basement team in the Big Ten. Have made a little bit of progress. Of course, have that signing of Braden Halliday, a son of MLB great Roy Halladay, kind of brought some attention to the program, but still off to a rocky start for the team. Also, this past weekend, games with men's golf, women's softball losing to Illinois, women's tennis losing to Ohio State, field hockey losing to Maryland, men's tennis beating Michigan State, and as I said, men's baseball losing to Indiana in back-to-back doubleheaders. But tomorrow, actually, even more with the condensed schedules of the Big Ten of college sports this year, a lot more weekday sports, not on a regular basis, but far more than there's been in the past, just because of the kind of condensed seasons with a lot of seasons starting late and the different restrictions and rules at various sites for outdoor and indoor activities. So Penn State golf getting underway at the Dunes Golf Club in Myrtle Beach. With their tournament, the General Hackler Championships, is a Big Ten tournament tomorrow. Women's golf doing the same in Charleston, South Carolina. Coming up this weekend, the 4 ranked teams will be playing on Friday and Saturday, with women's tennis going to Rutgers, wrestling in the NCAA championships against in St. Louis, and Penn State the favorite in this to win the Big Ten tournament, or to win the national championship as one of those top 2 seeds. As I said, baseball playing in Maryland, men's volleyball playing at NJIT, women's lacrosse at Michigan, tennis going to Wisconsin, women's volleyball against Michigan State, and a packed weekend of Penn State athletics this weekend. Just because the Penn State hockey game against Wisconsin happened so soon before the show started. Didn't really have a chance to prepare too much after that game, just because it was so soon. But Penn State hockey, just now, some comments from Coach Guy Godowski, and with the final goal, just as I was of course watching the game. What had happened is Penn State, who'd been trying to stop Cole Caulfield all day. He'd been obviously their prime target. He is hands down Wisconsin's best player, and he's the toughest player to stop in the country. But the final goal was just a rink long saucer pass of about 100-foot saucer pass from inside their own zone to Cole Caulfield, breaking out into the Penn State zone. And he was able to get on a breakaway and just beat Eric Audio 5-hole. So Penn State, of course, as we said, losing that game. And Cole Caulfield, he is just such a tough guy to guard. I mean, as we said, he leads the country in points and leads the country in goals. He had 27 goals this year. 27 goals. The next guy behind him, Colin Bielek, who had 18 goals. I mean, it is extremely rare for any hockey league in the world, whether it's the NHL, AHL, CHL, NCAA, for the difference between the first and second ranked players in goals at the end of the season to be that big of a difference, to be 9 goals. So Cole Caulfield just showing how dominant he can be. And again, he is only a sophomore, which is truly kind of remarkable. And obviously he will be going to the NHL, but he's 20 years old. Born in 2001, 20 years old. So it's just a bit wild. That first of all that he is so young and he's dominating like no one has ever dominated college hockey in quite a while, but also that he was drafted by the Vegas Golden Knights, and traded to or Montreal, or originally the rights owned by Vegas, but Penn State did a good job of shutting him down as much as they could. I mean, 27 goals in 29 games. It's pretty much a goal per game guy, and then two goals today in the third period later. So for the first about 45, 50 minutes of the game, they did do a good job of shutting him down, but not able to in the end, as Cole Caulfield scores the OT winner for Wisconsin. But yeah, as I said, just a few comments and recaps coming out about this game, which had ended just mere minutes before the start of our show. So with Penn State, Guy Gadowski, head coach of Penn State, has said after this game and prior to this that his team is worthy of a bid at the NCAA tournament, as they obviously had to deal with many factors outside of their control, such as the month-long COVID cancellations, and then of course they got blown out of that series at Notre Dame after that. Because they were so rusty. I mean, imagine not playing a game for 5.5 weeks and then playing teams that play 2-3 games a week was very tough. And then they showed it the next week when they won at Notre Dame yesterday, dominating them 6-3. That was just a week later. So they showed that with a couple games under their belt, they were able to get back into it and able to be a competitive team, nearly beating Wisconsin. I mean, if they had beaten Wisconsin, I think they would have been a favorite to win the Big Ten tournament after that. But so Guy Gadowski he's made the argument, that his team is worthy of a bid. I don't think that it's not an insane thing to say by any means, but it's just very unlikely. There's a lot of good teams. There's a lot of good teams that will be looking for at-large bids and all over this quirky schedule. But it does seem very unlikely. Excuse me. So Penn State, if they do, look for a large bid, it'll be them with some of the other teams, losing early in their tournaments, making good arguments for getting into the tournament. It would be, teams like Arizona State or Northeastern, UMass, Western Michigan, Omaha, Notre Dame, who they did just beat, UConn, Denver, Providence. A lot of these teams who Penn State will be kind of fighting with for these at-large bids, and it's just exceedingly unlikely unless Penn State is able to. Unless some other teams unfortunately come down with COVID issues, it does seem extremely unlikely that Penn State would do anything or be able to kind of make any noise in getting a bid. But moving on to some slightly happier news, Penn State women's hockey, who had their best season in their history, best season in the history of Penn State women's hockey this season. They've been a bit of a doormat in the CHA for years. And then this year, really, really breaking through in a big way. Didn't lose a game in regulation on home ice all year. 16-3-2 final record. Just sweeping teams, winning teams out left and right. Did have one postponed series, which was the postponed series, the home and home against RIT. Or actually had back-to-back series against RIT postponed. Excuse me. But in the CHA tournament, they did get upset in the first round. Losing to Syracuse 3-2. So Penn State, although they did lose in that first round of the CHA tournament, they will look for a bid in the NCAA women's hockey tournament, which will get going later this week. So still, regardless, still one of the best seasons a Penn State sports program's had in a while. Penn State women's hockey best season they've ever had. So a lot to be proud of for the Penn State women after that. But primarily, Penn State unfortunately focused on very rare that this happens because it's kind of the programs are in different directions, but bad news coming out of the hockey program with men's hockey getting losing in their upset bid of Wisconsin to go to the Big Ten championship game, and basketball with the positive news of hiring head coach Micah Shrewsbury. So Micah Shrewsbury, well, he should turn this program around on Penn State after losing Lamar Stevens, who was the best player, who took them to the brink of it. And it's the tournament berth last year. They probably would have been a 5 seed. They would have, there's a very good chance they could have made the Sweet 16 last year. But losing Lamar Stevens as well as Mike Watkins and some other big names, and then this year with Trent Buttrick and John Harrer and Taylor Nussbaum and Jamari Wheeler, most of all. Penn State, unfortunately, not kind of be restarting a little bit, but Micah Shrewsbury has plenty of connections, 20 years of coaching between the NBA and college, lots of connections for recruiting, and Penn State should be able to improve their recruiting pretty well off the bat with him. Just Jim Ferry was a bit of a buffer year following the surprising firing of Patrick Chambers, who had been the coach for about 10 years. He'd been the coach forever, and finally Penn State getting rid of him on some off-the-court issues. But Jim Ferry, given his role and his situation as an interim head coach, pretty good situation. But just with the hardest schedule in the country too, Penn State did have the hardest schedule in college basketball in 19 years. Given that situation, it was not very high expectations. But once they had lost to Nebraska a couple weeks ago, it kind of went downhill from there. But Penn State basketball, actually, it was just painful Penn State basketball fashion, coming so close. Unfortunately, like the hockey team, they did lose to Wisconsin by 1.1 goal. Lost to Wisconsin in the first round, or in the second round, 75-74. They beat Nebraska the day before, so went 2-1 against Nebraska this year, and then just barely losing to Wisconsin on March 11th, this past Thursday in their second game of the Big Ten tournament. If they'd won that, they would play Iowa. I mean, they had a shot. If they won this Wisconsin game, which was very close, Iowa would have been a good matchup for them. In all likelihood, they wouldn't have beaten Iowa and then Michigan or Ohio State and then Illinois. But a good performance for them. Just an unfortunate and painfully on-brand loss, as they have had so many close losses this season. Looks like that'll do it for us here on the Penn State Sports Report. Thank you for listening on Zingo TV, Spanglish Sports World. My name is Jeremy Schooler. I do want to remind all of our listeners, all of our viewers, we will be off next week. No Penn State Sports Report next week, but we will come back in 2 weeks on March 29th for our next episode of the Penn State Sports Report. We'll recap if Penn State were to somehow get a bid in hockey, we'll recap that and just the offseason as the offseason keeps going for Penn State football, who we didn't even have to touch on today. Just not a lot of news going on football, but recap the offseasons for Penn State hockey, basketball, football, and more. We'll see you in 2 weeks for that. Until then, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Zingo TV, Spanglish Sports World. My name is Jeremy Schooler.